Stranger, my message is short. Stand by and read it through. Every gravestone has a story behind it. Every person who died has something to say. And that was something that really came home very strongly to me as I prepared this episode. And the subtitle, Epitaphs of the Dead. This is a World War II story. And perhaps I first started thinking about this through my original work. I did my master's and at least a little bit of my PhD on ancient Roman history. And some of the inscriptions of Roman gravestones tell very human stories. So here's a couple of Roman gravestones. Stranger, my message is short. Stand by and read it through. Here is the unlovely tomb of a lovely woman. Her parents called her Claudia by name. She loved her husband with her whole heart. She bore 2 sons. Of these she leaves one on earth. Under the earth has she placed the other. She was charming in converse, yet proper in bearing. She kept house, she made wool. That's my last word. Go your way. And the second one, stranger, stop and turn your gaze towards this hillock on your left, which holds the bones of a poor man of righteousness and mercy and love. Wayfarer, I ask you to do no harm to this memorial. Gaius Atilius Jehodus, freedman of Serenus, a pearl merchant of Via Sacra, is buried in this memorial. Wayfarer, goodbye. And I've always appreciated those. They tell a story. If you walk around a modern Western graveyard, there's really not much to see. There will be the person's name, maybe how old they are, perhaps sometimes who was their wife or husband, and the simple R.I.P. Well, the Romans had the equivalent of R.I.P. They had dis manibus, often abbreviated simply to D.M., to the spirits of the dead or the spirits of the underworld. But they generally told a story, and as I walk around a graveyard, I wonder about those stories. And the second thing that inspired me to make this episode was the series of books by Sarah Wern called Epitaphs of the Great War, the Last 100 Days. Well, I'm looking at epitaphs of World War II, but she was largely doing the same thing, interestingly enough, and she even compared it to Twitter, because Twitter has a very limited character count, and I believe it was 66 characters was the maximum that family members were allowed to put on any of these gravestones. And all of them come from a single war cemetery, Becklingen in Germany, and that is where you'll find it. The nearest town is called Soltau. It's roughly halfway between Hanover and Hamburg, and most of the men who lie in that graveyard were originally buried somewhere else, somewhere in this general region you see on the map, but in order to properly care for all the war dead, they were dug up, often around 1946, and then they were reburied at Becklingen, where you find them today. And, well, all of the examples I give you today came from somewhere in this region. And this is just after you walk through the entrance arch, looking up to it. It's by no means the biggest one, but there's plenty that are smaller too. Their name liveth for evermore. And inside that arch, there's some quite nice words. This quiet resting place is dedicated to the memory of those who lost their lives. The cemetery contains 2,400 war burials of various nationalities. And inscribed in big letters on one side, the land on which the cemetery stands is the gift of the German people for the perpetual resting place of the sailors, soldiers, and airmen who are honoured here. Now, the main reason I visited this particular cemetery, in fact it was the main reason I went to northern Germany, was for the single grave in the centre here, A.J. Fowler. He was my uncle, my mother's older brother. And it was sort of a bit of a pilgrimage after all the research I'd already done to go and visit his gravesite. And to the right you can see there's R.W. Baker, Reginald Baker. He was the pilot of the Mosquito. And to the left you can see there's Sage. He was the pilot of another Mosquito from the same squadron who was shot down less than a kilometre away, and they were all buried, well, elsewhere before they were reburied at Becklingen. Now, I in particular paid attention when I was visiting this graveyard, not only to that of my uncle and the other crew who were in those mosquitoes, but to any gravestone that had one of these epitaphs at the bottom. It cost the families money, and the majority don't have one, but where they did, I took quite a few photos, and I'm featuring all aircrew. I have other photos that I may put in an episode later about soldiers who died, but all of the men who are in today's episode were in the Air Force. And the first one is very closely aligned with my family story. Now, if you've watched my previous episode about A.J. Fowler, Alexander John Fowler, he was a navigator in a Mosquito in 487 Squadron. Reginald Baker was the squadron commander, and I commissioned this painting that you see. I used it as the opening title page for that previous episode. So Reginald Baker, the squadron commander, was the pilot. You can see him waiting in the plane to take off, while my uncle, the navigator, is climbing up, taking one last look, because this painting is about his last day, the last takeoff. They would not return from this operation. And in the complete painting, there are 5 mosquitoes, because the squadron lost 5 planes that day. 8 men died, 2 were taken POWs. And when I commissioned this, I asked the artist in particular to put one other mosquito on the ground with them in close proximity, because this is the one that held Sage and Cockburn. And this gravestone you see here, Cockburn was just a little bit out of shot from that last photo to the left, because Sage was his pilot, and Jack Cockburn was the navigator, like my uncle was the navigator in the other plane. And this was the epitaph that somebody in his family had put on his gravestone. In the midst of life, we are in death. Thy will be done. Now, what exactly does this mean? You have to actually go back more than 1,000 years to get the answer to that question, because it's actually a quote, translated into English, from Notker the Stammerer. And yes, he was a monk who did have a serious stutter, hence his name. Medea vita in morte sumus, quem quaerimus adjutorum nisi te, domine, qui pro peccatis nostris juste resceris, etc., etc. In the midst of life we are in death. To whom may we look for help but from you, Lord, who for our sins are justly displeased? Yet, Lord God most holy, Lord most mighty, holy and most merciful Saviour, deliver us from the bitter pains of eternal death. Well, when you see the full context of that quote, it makes a bit more sense about why somebody might have chosen to have put it on a gravestone. The next grave that grabbed my attention was that of Arthur Clarence Cockayne. Now, the reason this one stuck out to me was because it was the next in sequence. So there was Baker, my uncle's pilot, my uncle, the other 2 crew members who died, and then the 5th gravestone in a sequence was this one. Now, he died a little bit earlier. Those other 4 men died in February 45. This guy died in January 45, so I knew he didn't die in the same operation, but he was on his own. Generally, if a plane went down, the crew would all be buried together. So he was a navigator. There was no pilot, there was nobody else. So I really thought, I've got to look up his gravestone and find out who he was, how he came to be here on his own. And that actually led me to this painting, which somebody had commissioned. Just like I had a painting of mosquitoes commissioned about my uncle's story, somebody else had commissioned a painting. And it was mainly focused on the pilot, whose name I temporarily forget, and Cockayne was the navigator. And they were doing a night intruder operation. Basically, night intruders, they would roam around Germany in the nighttime, obviously, looking for targets of opportunity. Maybe there's a train or a train station or whatever. In the case of this mosquito, they actually came across a German aerodrome, and there were fighters taking off and so on, so they went in and just fired it up. Took out a number of planes and things like this, but were hit by German flak, caught fire. The pilot told Cockayne to bail out while he stayed with the plane, and it crash-landed. Cockayne obviously did not make it and died. The mosquitoes went notoriously hard to bail out from. The hatches down on the side were quite difficult to get out of. The pilot himself was badly burned, but did in fact survive, and I think the person who commissioned that painting was somehow related to the pilot. And his epitaph on the bottom was, "To live in hearts we leave behind is not to die." And that is a quote from a poet, Thomas Campbell. And this poem, Hallowed Ground. What hallows ground where heroes sleep? 'Tis not the sculptured piles you heap, in dews that heavens far distant weep, their turf may bloom, or genii twine beneath the deep their coral tomb. But strew his ashes to the wind, whose sword or voice has served mankind. And is he dead, whose glorious mind lifts thine on high? To live in hearts we leave behind is not to die. Is it death to fall for freedom's right? He's dead alone that lacks her light, and murder sullies in heaven's sight the sword he draws. What can alone a noble fight? A noble cause. Well, there's more to it than that, but you can see it's very much about those who die for the cause of freedom, etc., etc. This quote in isolation has been used on numerous occasions. I think they featured prominently after Princess Diana died, and I saw Vin Diesel using it on a Facebook post, I think it was, for one of his friends that died from those Fast and Furious movies. So that quote in isolation gets used a lot, but I think people seldom see it in its proper context and realize it is for those fallen warriors. Next we come to John Ernest Gorwood. And you can see here it is this unusual thing, a dual grave for two men. Now my uncle and his pilot were originally buried in a single coffin, but they were able to identify and separate them and give them their own graves when they were moved to Becklingen. I guess in this case it was impossible to separate them, or maybe they had two bodies but they couldn't tell which one was which. So they buried them together, and you can tell from the symbols on the grave that one of them was a New Zealander and the other was an Englishman. Now Blatch was the New Zealander, but we're focusing in this case on the Englishman Gorwood, because he's the one who has the epitaph, "Cherished in Memory's Garden, Mother." And it does mention on the gravestone that he had a DFM. What was that? Distinguished Flying Medal? Oh, goodness me, I'm pretty sure. Something like that anyway. And I found the description of why he earned that award. Here it is. On the night of 17th April 1940, this airman was the wireless operator / air gunner of an aircraft, which after the successful completion of a gardening operation, carried out a reconnaissance of northern Denmark, during which large concentrations of enemy aircraft were observed at Aalborg Aerodrome. Gardening, by the way, was where you flew off the coast dropping mines to disrupt German coastal shipping. They called the mines vegetables. Carrying on. On the night of 20th April 1940, an aircraft in which this airman was wireless operator carried out a successful bombing attack on Aalborg Aerodrome under adverse weather conditions. In spite of intense opposition from the ground defences during which... In spite of intense opposition from the ground defences during which the aircraft was hit, 2 runs were made over the target. A fire was started in one of the aerodrome buildings as a result of the second attack. Leading aircraft man? Damn it, I should have looked that up before this. But anyway, LAC's a rank. Gorwood displayed outstanding ability, keenness and efficiency as a wireless operator air gunner, and by his enthusiasm and zeal, he has set an excellent example to other wireless operator air gunners. Awarded the Distinguished Flying Medal. Now, I guess that level of bravery is useful in war to a certain degree, but if you keep pushing that hard, well, you're going to end up dead, and sad to say. A little bit later, in September of 1940, he too was destined to die. Interestingly, I've commented in some of my previous episodes how many of these warriors I notice are products of the British Empire and are born in India or other places like this, and this guy is no exception. He was born in Bengal in 1920. And this is a photo, actually, from his squadron. Who knows, he may be even one of the men in here, for all I know. And this was a description of the attack from an Australian and Melbourne newspaper, the Argus. The pilot of the leading RAF plane told a story. "We were looking for our target," he said, and flew practically alongside a German transport plane, which was signalling, presumably for permission to land. Our rear gunner immediately gave him something to think about, and we managed to get in a good burst of fire before the German disappeared in clouds. The front and rear gunners strafed the airfield while we flew over dropping bombs. The main hangar was damaged. well, that was what they accomplished, but at the cost of losing a couple of planes, including this fellow whose grave we've just visited. Next we come to Arthur Henry Cassam, in proud and loving memory of our only son, Mum, Dad, Mary, Jeff, and Joan. Now, some of the previous ones went for highfalutin quotes, 1,000-year-old Latin sayings, etc. This one is much more mundane, but somehow much more touching and human. Now, it's interesting, the only son, so Mum and Dad is obvious. So who were Mary, Jeff, and Joan? Were they uncles and aunts? Because you'd normally think maybe they were siblings, but Jeff's clearly a boy's name, and he was the only son. So who were Mary, Jeff, and Joan? I don't know, but clearly a very personal memory of this 21-year-old young man who did not make it home. And they were, like my uncle, attacking German railways, and his plane, and this is the kind of plane he was in, was shot down. And according to what I could work out, they were intercepted by a German night fighter on the way home, and the kill was claimed by a German pilot, Hans Joachim Schmidt. And in the nature of war, you know, what's the saying? Those who live by the sword shall die by the sword. He too was destined to die just a few years later. He was lost at sea west of Brest when he ran out of fuel, April of 1943. Next we turn to a Canadian, Robert Cecil Fletcher. O valiant heart, tranquil you lie, your knightly virtue proved. And look at these great photos that come from this Canadian veterans website. In fact, you often get some quite good records and good photos if the person you're looking up just happens to be Canadian. The Canadians have done a really good job with this. And I just love those photos. You can see he was a real character. You know, he reminds me of somebody I used to know at high school. I can't quite place who it was, but he's got that kind of quirky look about him that reminds me of somebody I used to know. And he was with 156 Squadron in a Lancaster, and they were actually shot down unusually during a daylight operation. 2 Lancasters were shot down while they were attacking Hamburg, and it's said, as near as I can gather, that they're actually shot down by an ME-262, which was one of these early German jet fighters, which says it was very late in the war. And the quote comes from a poem from Sir John Stanhope Arkwright. And the poem appeared in a book collection from 1919, just after World War I, The Supreme Sacrifice and Other Poems in Time of War. Now, this poem has been set to various tunes, but most commonly you'll hear it to a tune composed by Gustav Holst, more commonly known for the suite The Planets, because he wrote it for this poem in 1931. And this is not the whole lot, but this is a couple of stanzas. O valiant hearts, who to your glory came through dust of conflict and through battle flame, tranquil you lie, your knightly virtue proved, your memory hallowed in the land you loved. Proudly you gathered rank on rank to war, as who had heard God's message from afar. All you had hoped for, all you had, you gave to save mankind. Yourselves you scorned to save. And I got sick of YouTube dinging me every time I try to play music for copyright infringement, so I wasn't going to play any of this, but there's a screenshot of one of the YouTube clips where you can hear this hymn being sung, so you can go and look it up and listen to it for yourself. But interestingly, in the comments to this particular YouTube clip, there was an old person who was saying that they well remembered singing this during World War II, so it would have been very contemporary and well known to the family who had this put on the gravestone. Next we have Ivan Wesley Kelly, and he was in the same plane as Robert Fletcher, so same squadron obviously, and all 8 men who were aboard this plane died. Now that's a sad story in its own right, because normally a Lancaster only carried 7 men, but for some reason, I don't know why, they were carrying 2 navigators that day. And as a result, they were overcrewed, and instead of losing 7 men, they lost 8. Bad luck for the extra guy who came along, I guess. Well, bad luck for them all. And look how young he looks in those photos. A fellow Canadian. If you're interested in 156 Squadron, there's a whole book about them. They led the way. Well, I forgot. In God we trust. A very simple epitaph, but As I said, the family would have paid money to have that put there. These things under the cross are not random. They're only there if the family requested them. Next, we move to an Australian, Kenneth Rae Galt. Well, I might not know who is John Galt, but I can tell you something about Ken Galt. To the world he was but one. To me he was all the world. Audrey. Now, of all of the ones in this episode, that's the one that hits me the hardest. That's really sad. You can see there's a world of hurt in those words. And who exactly was this Audrey who lost her world when she lost Ken Galt? Well, what do we know about him? He was with 460 Squadron, and since I couldn't find much when I was Googling around for him, I turned from the UK National Archives to the 460 Squadron Operations Record Book, and studying what happened that day. 22 Lancasters hit Hanover, 2 didn't return. Now, under normal circumstances, we often lost 5%, or in catastrophic raids, 15%. I've seen casualties for some attacks on Berlin. Only losing 2 out of 22 would be considered a great success. Of course, if you happened to be in one of the planes that got shot down, as was Ken Galt, well, the odds were against you. And for some reason, again, couldn't learn why, this was also another 8-man crew. And here's what the operations book said. This aircraft left its base at the appointed times, since when nothing has been heard of either the aircraft or the crew. They took off, they didn't come back, we don't know what happened to it. On the other hand, the attack itself, as recorded in their various comments in the operations record book, looks like it was considered to be a great success. If, bombing a city and burning it is successful, here's what they said. Overwhelming success. The whole town was ablaze. Best raid I've ever seen. Provided Pathfinder Force, that's PFF, provided Pathfinder Force were on the spot, there could not be much left of Hanover, as attack was strongly concentrated. And I did even manage to find in this case, who was Audrey? Audrey Venice Galt. Well, Audrey Franklin before she got married, and they'd only got married in 1942, and you can see that Galt was killed in September of 43, so they hadn't been married very long. I guess it was one of those weddings before he went off to war, and he did not come home. And poor Audrey, well, you can see how she felt. And of course, there's always 2 sides to every story. And when you're in Germany visiting these places on the ground, well, you can see how the Germans remember the Allied bombing of their cities. And so when you're in Hanover, you can go visit this church that has been left as a ruin to commemorate all the dead from that bombing campaign. And in the stonework on the floor, there is a simple inscription, Unseren Toten, our dead. And it records there that 6,782 were killed from all of the many bombing operations over Hanover. And this one in September, which all the pilots thought was so wonderfully successful, wasn't even the worst day for Hanover. It was actually the next month, in October of 1943, that they suffered over 1,000 dead on a single day. And interestingly, at the base of that bell tower, they have another bell hanging, and it's a bell from Hiroshima in Japan, because Hanover and Hiroshima are now sister cities, and I guess their common sense of loss, shall we say, has united them to be sister cities. Now, the Australians, like the Canadians, have done a good job of commemorating these men who gave their all. This is a great museum, by the way. I've been lucky enough to visit it twice. It's the Australian War Memorial Museum in Canberra, the Australian capital. And I saw this beautiful thing they're doing right at the moment. Roll of Honour name projection. Kenneth Rae Galt's name will be projected onto the exterior of the Hall of Memory on 18th of June 2023, 26th of August 2023, 13th December 2023, and lastly on the 6th of April 2024 at 4:11 a.m. So I guess if you had a family member who was lost, you could make a particular point of visiting and seeing the name of your lost grandfather or uncle or whoever. The next grave, Terence Raymond Whitehead, in memory of those happy days when we were all together, Mam, Dad, Don, and Olga. Again, another very personal one, but another one you can just have the sense of loss that the family suffered with Don and Olga, brother and sister, that would be my guess. And, Terence, should we call him Terry? Terry Whitehead, 97 Squadron Lancaster, failed to return from an operation against Bremen. And I didn't learn much about him, but I did get the name of his mam and his dad. They were Walter and Hetty Whitehead. Next we have Leonard, who was known as Len Arthur Drummond. Always thoughtful, willing and kind. What a beautiful memory he left behind. He was with the 97 Squadron Lancaster, part of the Pathfinder Force. If you don't know what the Pathfinders are, to try to ensure the accuracy of these night bombing attacks, you would have a earlier force that would go in with these flares that would light up, sometimes green or other colours, and they would be responsible for being really careful to find the target, because all of the wave of hundreds of follow-up bombers just knew when you see the green flare, bomb the green flare. So if the Pathfinders didn't lay it in the right place, well, then all the follow-up waves would also bomb in the wrong place. And this was another attack on Hanover. Now, I found a fascinating story about what happened to Len Drummond, because I learned that the official cause of loss is untrue, because when this Lancaster was shot down, one crew member, only one, survived, and he dishonestly reported that they had been shot down by a night fighter. And, let me tell you the story of what really happened. And this story comes from two sources. One is the book Flying into Hell, which contains some of the story of the one survivor from this plane, and the other one is this website, Aircrew Remembered. And from it, I managed to learn something about all the men who were aboard that plane. The pilot was Flying Officer Duncan Moody, born in Hong Kong, another product of the British Empire, but he enlisted in Canada. The navigator was James Bundle from Portsmouth. Their bomb aimer was from Denmark, Norman Clausen from Svendborg. His parents had been in the Danish resistance, had been arrested by the Nazis and executed by the Gestapo. Their wireless operator, Sergeant Tom Geordie Stamp. Apparently he was shy. From near Newcastle, well, that's why his nickname was Geordie. I don't know if you know what a Geordie accent sounds like. Let me tell you, it is indecipherable. Geordies have their own unique way of speaking English that sounds like a completely different language. The flight engineer was Sergeant Les Melbourne. He was the old man aboard the plane at 31. And the rear gunner, Arthur Hughes, was only 19. And then Len, our gravestone, Len Drummond was the mid-upper gunner whose parents ran a pub near Burton-on-Trent. Now Norman Clausen, the Dane, he was the sole survivor. He bailed out and managed to stay on the run for 10 days before he was eventually captured. The rest of them didn't manage to bail out. And Clausen recounted his story to this Mel Rolfe. Arthur Hughes, the rear gunner, called out to Flying Officer Moody that an aircraft was coming close to them and to commence weaving. It was his last words as immediately another Lancaster collided with them, causing an explosion with the two aircraft heading straight down. So I guess we can see why he lied, because being killed by the enemy sounds better than the simple fact that two British bombers had a mid-air collision and, well, both planes went down as a result of that. You can see his motivation for not telling the truth until many years later. Clausen says he was desperately trying to get his parachute on as the bomber was plunging towards the ground. He'd only got it half attached when there was another explosion that threw him clear, knocked him unconscious, but he, came to in enough time to open his chute and land successfully. 3 of the men from the other Lancaster successfully bailed out, but were murdered after they landed by German troops on the ground. So it was just as well for Clausen that he managed to stay on the run for 10 days. And that is how Len Drummond died. Next we have Ken James Offer. I'll see you again, my darling, at the dawn of a beautiful day. Another loss, another wife. He was with 103 Squadron and another Lancaster, again bombing Hanover. Well, it's not surprising because this graveyard, as I explained already, is for people who died in those areas around Hamburg and Hanover in northern Germany. Didn't learn much about his story, but his pilot was an Australian, L.J. Hinton, and the description was nothing was heard from the aircraft after takeoff, and it failed to return to base. Now, interestingly, and I don't know why, 4 of the crew are buried at Becklingen, and the other 3 have no known grave. I guess they were not able to identify them, or the plane went into the ground at such a rate that they were buried. I mean, they still occasionally find bodies and plane crash sites around Germany every now and again. Or maybe they were burnt up. I mean, who knows? Why? Only 4 of the 7. And they're said to have been shot down by a Heinkel night fighter. And I did manage to identify who was the person who called Ken Offer her darling. It was Doris Offer, who before she got married in 1938 was Doris Goodwin. Now, Ancestry.com's records, there's a lot of Doris Goodwins or Doris Offers out there, but I think she actually did remarry in 1947. And I found a picture of one of these Heinkels, a Heinkel 219AO. That was the night fighter who was said to have shot them down, and the picture even has a Lancaster in the background. Next we come to Robert John Stingle from 431 Squadron. Say not with longing, they are no more. Say rather thankfully, they were. Now this is another guy who I think was a real character based on his Canadian photos. Remember I told you the Canadian websites have some really good records. You can see him with a moustache and without, but each one, you can just imagine him, well I can, certainly telling, just about to break into a joke or something like that. And how did he die? Well, it's the collided off Nordeney Island with another 431 Lancaster, both falling into the sea. So another collision. I guess when you've got hundreds of bombers in the air, and you can see on this map there's that sort of red area. It's one of these East Frisian islands off the north coast of Germany. There's a whole bunch of them all along the coast. They're not much more than sandbars, frankly. And you think, oh, what a way to die. And what was going on there? Well, it was very late in the war. Like, what was the date? Let's go back to the gravestone. It was the 25th of April, Anzac Day, no less, of 1945. The war was almost over. And the Germans had really heavily fortified this island, Wangerooge Island. It was only 8.5 kilometers long by 1 kilometer wide because it guarded the entrance to this estuary with Wilhelmshaven down there, and the Germans had been worried for, well, a long time about a British or Allied landing down that estuary that might attack Wilhelmshaven, so they had really beefed up the fortifications, and the Allies decided that late in the war that they needed to, well, take it out, I guess. They sent 482 bombers against it, and it's actually the last big air raid against German territory in World War II. Sorry, I'm just going to carry on this episode. It's too late for me to pause it. That was my phone going well. Okay, now, yes, it was the last major big bomb raid of World War II. Now, the stupid thing, so many bombers attacking such a small sliver of land meant that they were concentrating hundreds of aircraft into such a small space. There were 3 collisions. 3 times Lancasters crashed into each other and the planes fell into the sea. So the Germans managed to shoot down 1, but 6 other planes were lost because of mid-air collisions. Now, in one sense, everybody dies, and what's the difference? But in another sense, you think, what a stupid way to die. Right at the end, in the very last big bombing raid, you die because your plane crashed into another plane. Now, I don't mean it in the slightest to diminish the sacrifice made by Robert Stingle, but I know if it had been my family member, I would have thought, goodness me, it would have made me more bitter, I think. So, at least my uncle, well, there are reasons to feel bitter about the way my uncle died. Certain people blamed the pilot and other things. I don't know how true any of that is. But on the other hand, I had a great uncle on my dad's side who was a ground crew in England, an older man, and they were responsible for putting up barrage balloons, and their truck drove into a crater, and he was killed in the truck crash. Well, in a sense, you could say the Germans killed him because German bombing made the crater, but in another sense, it's hardly a glorious death, is it? He died in a truck crash. But he was serving in the war and paid the ultimate sacrifice nevertheless. And it's more, I feel, like the bitterness of the loss. Couldn't Stingle have just made it for another month and made it through the war? But sadly, some men die on the first day of the war, some men die right at the end. And that was the story of how he died. Oh yes, and he was buried, last comment I forgot to make, he was buried at Cuxhaven originally, which is the second arrow, the one on the right, and he was reburied at Becklingen on Christmas Eve in 1946. And this photo is actually from that exact raid, and there are two Lancasters bombing the island. And I don't know, they are pretty close together, and you could just imagine, say, the one at the bottom deciding they'd finished their run and just, pulling back on the joystick and going a bit higher and colliding with the other one, or who knows, with so many hundreds of aircraft in the air over such a small target. Well, as I said, 6 planes lost to collisions. Yeah, what a way to die. And so they passed away. This was the original grave of my uncle, in dirt, before they'd had time to start making the proper stone gravestones. And this is a photo of a group of young men off to war. Now, the one on the top left is my uncle, and, a collection of other guys. Most of them have New Zealand on their arms, but, they could equally but well be Canadians and Brits and Australians and whatnot else. Just a collection of young men enjoying themselves, but so many of them would one day lie in places like Becklingen. And just to bring back the human nature of it one more time, I want to just recap everybody we talked about with one detail. Their age, how young they all were, and to humanize them just as they probably were known by their families and friends. There was Jack, who was 29. There was Arthur, who was 35. He was the old man. There was John, who was just 20. There was another Arthur, who was 21. There was Robert. Maybe he was just called Bob, who was 20. There was Ivan, who was 20 as well. There was Ken, who was 23. There was Terry, who was 21. There was Len, who was just 20. And another Ken of 29. And last but not least, who died right at the end of the war, there was another Bob, who was 21 years old. All of these movies show the actors tend to be way too old, because I guess they want famous actors who have built a bit of a reputation. But really, if you want to make a proper World War II movie, you've got to have a very young cast where a lot of them are only 19, 20, 21. And there is me at the end of my visit to the Becklingen. And I don't know if you can see it in my face, but I can tell you I was feeling a sense of loss, a sense of shock almost. So certainly overwhelmed by the spirit of the occasion, because it wasn't just my uncle's grave, it was all the other gravestones. And I also remember all the graves which were just simply known unto God, in other words, unidentified. There was a man buried there, but nobody even knew who he was. And that is all I have for you today. So I'm going to say good evening.